Today we're going to talk about PMO metrics and KPIs, and what you have to do or some considerations to put in place before you really dig deep into what you want to do from a metric and KPI perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between KPIs and metrics and how you go about defining those. We'll walk through a KPI metric framework. We'll talk about how you do that strategic alignment to your KPIs and metrics, selection, as well as get into a little bit about presenting those back to your users. One of the reasons why KPIs and metrics are so difficult is if you think about your user community that you service from a PMO perspective, your stakeholders. More than likely you have a very broad spectrum of people that you interact with from a PMO function. Everybody has different needs. A lot of your stakeholders will have different goals and objectives. A lot of them are going to have different ways that they're going to value your success or project delivery success or portfolio success. And so this can be a difficult nut to crack, and it is one worthy of taking some time and being somewhat thoughtful and planful before you dig in. But also being willing to do a little bit of trial and error as you grow into it and mature how you deliver KPIs and metrics. So why do you even need KPIs or metrics? Good metrics are means of continuous improvement from a project or portfolio perspective. So it's a great way to basically put a line in the sand and say, here's where we started, and put some targets and goals out there as far as how you want to either improve project delivery or improve performance. They can also serve as early warning signs for when things are running amok, as well as they can serve as great triggers for both project risk as well as organizational risk. In the long term, what you really want your metrics or KPIs to be able to do is really measure both what your projects are actually accomplishing, but probably more importantly, how they're driving the strategic goals, objectives, and capabilities of your organization. So a little bit about using metrics. They allow you to catch mistakes before they lead to other mistakes. They enable you to determine if you're hitting your targets and milestones, if you're getting better or worse. And sometimes metrics are often ignored because they're hard to define and collect. And this is where putting in the planful and pragmatic approach as far as how you define and collect your metrics is important. If you're in an organization where possibly you don't have a lot of technology or solutions to support your PMO space, defining and collecting metrics can be a very manual process, often driven by spreadsheets or the aggregation of other types of documentation. If you're in that situation, what you may want to do is you think about starting to pull together a metrics portfolio or a metrics library is start pretty small and simplistic, and then as your organization matures and or you get some more technology or automation behind your processes, you can start to expand that. In my last position before joining Results Positive, I did walk into an organization where project management was still being done by spreadsheets and Word documents, and so the amount of resource hours it took for the team that I was managing or took over the management of to pull together all of those metrics, compile them into a fashion that could be consumed by a stakeholder. Pretty much by the time we completed one cycle, the portfolio analysts were starting another cycle. And so if you're thinking about doing metrics in your organization and you currently don't have technology in place, use your some of your metrics as preliminary requirements to help you define what technologies you may want to put in place, because it will also help you drive some of the metrics that you may use. So some of the confusion that occurs over metrics, often organizations don't know what variables to emphasize. They don't know what to select or how to select them. You run into instances where people define and measure things differently. So Amber to the VP of Marketing could be a very different construct than what what Amber may mean to CIOs. How those metrics will be reported, and again, you know, think about pulling together your C-level leadership. If you're reporting your portfolio financial measures and you put those out in some form of a spreadsheet format, your CFO is probably going to be able to consume that pretty easily and readily, where your marketing and sales folks will probably be better served with you know, some sort of graphic or optic. And that's not to say that marketing and sales folks, you know, aren't great consumers of spreadsheets, but one of the things you need to keep in consideration as you're pulling your metrics together are your different stakeholders, how they can consume the information, and what optics you want to put in front of them so that your metrics are considered, you know, a value-added deliverable from your PMO. So a little bit about metrics versus KPIs. They are different. So KPI is a measurement of items relevant to performance. Good KPIs drive change, but they often don't prescribe a course of action. So again, they'll put a line in the sand as to where you're at, but they're not normally positioned where at the end of them you absolutely know which direction you have to go. You have to leverage the information that you pull out of a KPI and chart that course of action. As you're dissecting a KPI, you know, again, it's pretty much in its definition, but from the key perspective, it's a major contributor of success or failure. The P is performance, and so you do want that to be measurable, quantifiable, and somewhat controllable. So you want to have thresholds that people can understand. And then the indicator component is you want some reasonable reputation of both current performance as well as what future performance may look like. So a little bit more around KPIs. You want them to be predictive. You want them to be measurable. You want them to be actionable. You want them to be relevant, so they should be directly related to the success or failure of a given project, program, or even the success criteria that you may have wrapped around a portfolio if you're going to do KPIs at the portfolio level. To the degree that they could be automated, that's awesome. And ideally you want them few in number, and this goes to both KPIs as well as metrics. In the previous organization I was in, you know, the ePMO actually reported up through IT, and on a quarterly basis they delivered this massive reporting deck to C-level leadership, and they basically, you know, had a bunch of KPIs and metrics that they had to cross these IT functions. And the deck that it went into ended up being over 80 pages in length. So the time that it took, you know, the people in the analytics portion of IT to pull it together, even though a lot of the stuff was automated, and get it into a consumable product was somewhat large. And it was such where it was so large that a lot of the executives had a hard time consuming it because there was a lot of information that was very IT-centric. And so the one thing to think about is particularly if you're delivering KPIs or metrics to your business people, you may want to have a section that is, you know, more business-centric so that, you know, the business folks can consume those and understand the performance of a given, you know, portfolio, project, or program, and then possibly a separate set of KPIs or metrics if you report into a technology function or a different function that is more function-centric. So a little bit around measuring organizational performance and how you want to tie that in to the information that you're going to be presenting in your measures and metrics. If you think about how an organization structures its business planning cycle, they normally start with mission, vision, and values. And then from there, they want to come up with some sort of set of strategies that are going to drive how they deliver organizational capabilities, whether those capabilities are internal or whether they're possibly external or customer-focused. Or you could be in a service organization where you're driving services. And so often those strategies will tie to financial results, customer satisfaction, internal learning and growth, internal processes, staff satisfaction, as well as probably more so now than when we were all younger or when our parents were working. A lot of organizations and companies have a big drive in place for community and environmental involvement. And so you'll see a lot of organizations will start to put performance measures, whether they're metrics or KPIs, around how the various strategies and initiatives that they're employing drive improvements in that community and environmental space. Once you get your strategies and issues and initiatives defined, you then need to come up with your critical success factors. So what differentiates something from working well versus not working well. And then typically out of that you get metrics and then KPIs. And again, those metrics and KPIs tying back to financial results, customer satisfaction, processes, and community and environment. And again, this is looking at organizational performance at what I would call, a corporate type level. If you're a discrete business unit, maybe in a larger corporation, you would more than likely pare that down based on the products and services that you're delivering. The other thing to think about metrics and KPIs is, often if you're in a highly regulated organization, there will be certain measures, metrics, or KPIs that will come out of that regulatory environment, whether it's, Sarbanes-Oxley, ISO, anything in the healthcare space, financial services, FINRA, those sorts of things. And so you'll often want to weave those components into your metric or KPI library. So a little bit about a metrics framework. So some qualities around a good metrics framework is you want a certain level of relevance. You want to be able to tie your reporting back to what your organization is trying to accomplish. So that goes back to tying it to your strategy, goals, and objectives. You want to make sure that you have the right number of metrics. And I typically recommend that organizations start with a pretty small set of measures and metrics, and then as you get a really rock-solid foundation in place, you start layering on additional ones, particularly if you're starting in the PMO space and maybe your PMO 1, 2, or 3 years old, and you're depending on whether you took a grassroots approach or you had strong sponsorship from the top, the number of metrics that you want to start out with. Again, you probably want to keep those relatively few and very focused. It's really important that each metric have an owner, and this is much like if you think about having a good project sponsor on a project. I think we all understand what it's like to be in a project where your project sponsor is maybe doing sponsorship by absenteeism, or your sponsor doesn't really have any skin in the game. The same thing happens when you've got a metric out there that doesn't have an owner or a champion around it. That person doesn't always have to be an executive level person, but you definitely want somebody that is owning that metric and is going to be accountable to that metric and is actually using the information from that metric to drive some form of performance or improvement. So the qualities of good metrics, you want them to be easily communicated and understood by your users. You want a certain level of detail that supports decision making, so you don't want the metrics so complicated that the users can't determine the validity of the metric and then being able to determine whether or not they can drive decisions out of it. And you also want your metrics to reinforce the desired behavior. So whether you're working on process improvement, whether you're working on obtaining a certain goal or objective, maybe you're looking to improve cost effectiveness, you want to make sure that those metrics drive towards those behaviors. So some approaches to metrics and reporting. One of the things you want to focus on first is your metrics definition, and ideally you want a mixed bag of leading-based metrics, so those are things that drive performance, and lagging-based metrics, which are the things that more are measures of outcomes. As I've noted before, you want to keep the number of metrics that you have to a limit, but keep those somewhat balanced over things like business alignment, your management functions, organization, technology. And then you definitely want them to be visible and understood by the people that are consuming them. From a reporting perspective, you definitely want to keep it starting at the highest level and boiling down to the degree that you can have them somewhat layered and embedded. That's always helpful as well. And you also want your metrics to be aligned to processes to the degree where that makes sense. So around defining a metric, and this is very similar to how you go about determining requirements for a project. And you want to pretty much take the same level of rigor for defining your metrics as you would for working through the requirements gathering process for a project. So you start with the business objective, and this is basically answering the question, of what are we trying to accomplish. You come up with a short description of the metric. You want to define the inputs that are needed for the metric, and not just the inputs, but particularly if you're going to go into other systems or processes to find those inputs, make sure that you map out where those are coming from. You want to incorporate the calculation, and this is also very important for when you deliver those metrics back to the stakeholders. It's very helpful if they understand, even as simple as, how do you calculate red, amber, or green for various project or program deliverables, so that they understand what's driving those colors to change. Your data retrieval processes, this could be manual, it could be technical. How often you're going to pull these metrics, and then we talked about the owners, as well as the targets. And so from a target perspective, it's also important not just to define what the target is, but to make sure that you get some level of consensus around when a metric is in that good area, or when the target has been diluted, or is in a poor, has basically a poor result. So from an example perspective, the metric on the slide is around reducing IT capital expenditures. And so the definition is you're looking at the actual capital expenditures as a percentage of plan. Your inputs to your capital budgeting process, anything from budget change reports, as well as anything from your OpEx reclass reports or things that may come out of financial systems. The calculation is your actual expenditures across your planned budget. And then in this example, they're going to pull the information on a monthly basis. It's going to be a manual consolidation. The owner of this particular metric, we're saying, is the Director of IT Infrastructure. And then they've established the targets. By putting your metrics in this kind of a format, what it helps people do is understand really what you're trying to get at. It also gives them a clear framework to move back to, particularly if you're introducing new leaders into the organization, and maybe you've had a metrics dashboard in place for a certain period of time, and you want to get them quickly up to speed as to what those measures and metrics are. Pulling this together in a document that can be consumed on an ongoing basis and updated as your metrics mature and improve or expand is helpful. A little bit around metric selection. You want to make sure that the metrics or KPIs that you're selecting are worth collecting. And so this goes back to somewhat similar to requirements. They should tie back to what it is you're trying to accomplish from a strategic perspective. You want to make sure that they're informative. You don't want to collect measures or metrics that you're not going to use. And you want to train your user community and the people that are consuming these metrics around the value of them. And don't make the assumption that everybody understands what a metrics or KPI is. If you're going to be rolling out a new metrics dashboard for your PMO, spend some time on doing some stakeholder education and engagement around what your metrics are, the difference between a metric and a KPI, et cetera, so that people are all grounded on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So one thing when you start into the process of gathering metrics, and particularly depending on how you go about it, not everything that you're going to get input on it is going to be necessarily usable, and in all instances it's not necessarily a good thing. What I've done with a lot of organizations in the past is you're looking to engage stakeholders on portfolio metrics, project or program metrics from an EPMO perspective. You can do it in a couple of ways, but your end result is basically the same. You can somewhat do, think of them almost, again, as requirements gathering sessions where you pull key groups of stakeholders into a room and you capture their ideas by having them put things up on the wall and somewhat moving those around based on a set of categories that you as your organization decides they're going to capture metrics on, whether it's business and strategy alignment, portfolio performance, project delivery. There are a couple of different categories that you can come up with. The other approach is going in and spending time one-on-one with key select individuals and basically interviewing them and walking them through sort of an interview around what type of metrics that they're interested in to get more information about the performance of your PMO or the performance of given projects. One of the challenges that a lot of organizations come up against is everybody feels that real-time reporting is the be-all and end-all to how metrics are delivered. There is a cost to real-time reporting, and so as you're looking to start a metrics dashboard for your PMO, you want to put a fair amount of thought around whether you need real-time reporting or if this is something that can be done on a weekly, monthly, quarterly type cycle. You want to make sure that, again, I would start simple. If you put super complex metrics and measures out there, while it may be something that the PMO might have be interested in, you need to think of your broader stakeholder audience. A lot of organizations want to start with a lot of metrics reporting around earned value and some of the more robust project delivery reporting type measures. And what we typically do is recommend that they save those for a second or third round, just because you need a lot of robust scheduling practices in place. You need solid resource management processes in place. You need solid financial reporting processes in place. And oftentimes getting those three things to kind of gel together is a lot more difficult than organizations really understand. The other thing is, if you're going to be automating your metrics, you may have some funding limitations as to how many of those metrics can be automated, particularly if you're going to be requiring feeds from other systems and things of that nature. So again, it's important to treat your metrics initiative like you would a project, so that you don't overcommit yourself to delivering something that doesn't make sense. And then also take the time to take a step back every so often, whether it be quarterly, semi-annually, or even incorporate as part of your annual planning process, to periodically review your metrics and make sure that you're still getting from them what you need and that they're still meaningful to the organization. As organizational strategies, goals, and objectives change, oftentimes your metrics will need to morph with those. Additionally, as organizational leadership changes, metrics will often need to morph with those. when I was the PMO leader of a large insurance company, for a lot of those people at the C-level part of the organization, it was their first time in a C-level position. So when I started managing the PMO at that company, the metrics looked very different than they did when I left that organization. And at that point, some of the leaders had been swapped out. Others of them had been in their position for a greater period of time and said their informational needs were different. And so you will need to review your metrics on a periodic basis. So again, looking at your different categories for selecting metrics, you'll often have a backward-looking view, and these are metrics that are fixed for the duration of the project. And so as you think about metrics that are used to measure whether a project is successful or not throughout the life cycle of a project, often those types of metrics have time and cost associated with them. And then there's more of a forward or present view of metrics. And those are often driven more by management goals and objectives rather than fixed cost and time. So metrics, similar to KPIs, they need to have a purpose. They need to be focused on a target. They should reflect the true status of a project or program, so it's important that if you define a set of metrics that are project and program delivery related, that not only do your stakeholders, like the sponsors and your C-level management, understand it, but your project and program managers have an understanding of it too, so that they understand what their initiatives are being measured on. And you want to make sure that your measures and metrics are being used by stakeholders as a tool for informed and actionable decision making. And this is why it's important to make sure that they're being used and are valid on a regular basis. And then different types, you've got your quantitative metrics, you've got directional, so are things getting better or worse? You've got financial, so things like profit margins, ROI, NPV. You have milestone-based metrics. And then you've got your end results, success factors, things like customer satisfaction. So here's an example of a metrics scorecard from an organization. The ones highlighted in red are ones that very much could be impacted by a PMO. So this example is more of a PMO that is sitting in an IT organization. So if you think about things around strategy and business alignment, think about the amount of spend and allocation that is going to strategic investments versus run-the-business type investments. Look at the amount of IT spend or project spend that is aligned specifically to a business unit or strategic goal. Look at the ROI on current investments and the NPV of new projects. As you think about your organization skills, what's your IT staffing against projects by function? What's your IT sourcing mix? So how many, as you think about people that are working on projects, how many of them are IT employees? How many total employees do you have? How much of your project or portfolio do you have to leverage outsourced vendors or contractors? And what type of support ratios need to be put in place after your projects are put into production? So you think about your PMO governance space, the percent of spend of revenue versus your OPEX, percent of spend that's going against your run-the-business or lights-on type operations, the percent of spend basically based on function, the delivery metrics around key projects, and then your burn rate metrics, so what's your actual dollars versus planned dollars over a period of time, and the same thing goes for your staffing. So your actual labor hours against what you plan labor for given projects. Your metrics are also very much based on the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So if you think about metrics in a similar way that you think about your change management plans around the delivery of a project, the other thing you want to ensure is who will collect the information, when will the information be collected, how will the information be reported, what and when should be measured, who should be measuring it, and who will perform the measurement. So this goes back to the matrix that we walked through earlier to make sure that you've got these variables all defined. So setting boundaries, oftentimes you've got various thresholds for a given metric or KPI, and you want to align that from a target perspective, and then what kind of performance are you going to report. And this goes to basically the red, amber, green of a measure or metric. And this is where making sure that you've got the calculations are well understood, you've got the various targets communicated so that the CIO's version of amber is aligned to what the CFO's version of amber is, and that people understand what actions need to be taken if a metric dips into an unfavorable or risk type category. Optics are another important component, and so this goes to how you're going to deliver your metrics. I've seen organizations that have robust technology where they can, they've made the investment in reporting systems, whether those are things like Business Objects or Cognos, or other tools. You may be pulling information from various systems and using spreadsheets to help compile and categorize. And so, leveraging Excel for charts and graphs, or then turning around and dumping that into PowerPoint. And any of those approaches, work, and often, again, depending on the maturity of your organization and the resources that you have to bring to bear to help gather your metrics, can work well. But as you're looking at the stakeholders that you're delivering those metrics to, put some thought as to what makes sense from a delivery perspective as far as optics. You're not going to necessarily be able to make everybody happy because, again, your financial folks are probably going to be able to do a fair amount with spreadsheets. But a picture is still worth 1,000 words, and to the degree that you can mix optics into your metrics and reporting packages, they will be better consumed and understood by your end users. And so, pie charts, dials, bar charts, bubble charts, area spread graphs are all effective ways of communicating various types of measures and metrics. A little bit about project and program KPIs. Project and program performance is often, there are often financial measures and metrics that are incorporated into that. So again, whether it's project spend, whether it's over a course of time or spend by the end of a various project, meeting specific goals, deliverables, and milestones. You need to consider the things that you're going to be looking at. So how are you adhering to your constraints, issues, risks? And then again, looking at your stakeholders, so that target audience. And sometimes you're going to have to tweak various metrics and measures based on that target audience. So, what you communicate to the executive team as far as the health of a given project may look a little bit different than what the actual project team that's working on the project. They both have different needs from a data consumption perspective. So keep that in mind as you're looking to define and determine what metrics to report out. And you may have certain metrics that never go to a project team directly. They could be available to them for consumption, but again, what a project team is looking at on the daily basis from a life of a project looks a little bit different than what your executives are considering. We talked about categories of KPIs and improper selection. And then here's some PMO-specific metrics. So as you think about strategy and business alignment, again, we talked about being aligned, the percent of projects that are aligned to strategic investments. Investment class of projects is a measure or metric that oftentimes PMOs leverage. So typically that's based on a run the business, grow the business, transform the business, or innovate the business. You may have certain business unit targets. So maybe one part of your organization has more money to pull into strategic projects than others. So being able to feed back to the organization, which parts of your business are driving which types of projects is often a good metric to start with. Project effort, so how much time people are spending on projects versus maintenance and enhancements. And this is where resource management plays a pretty big key into your PMO. And while your PMO may be focused on the delivery of strategic projects, a lot of PMOs also have a space where users are able to book time, or they're able to get the other side of the demand as far as what it takes to run the business. Resource utilization is another great operational efficiency PMO metric. And then project turn, how many projects are often put on hold or canceled? Why are they canceled? What was the business driver? As far as project execution, the percent of projects delivered on time, on budget, with a certain quality metric, variances to budget, variances to your resource or effort forecast. If you're thinking about looking at variances to schedule and so forth, make sure that you do put a little bit of effort into what your scheduling practices are going to be. I found that a lot of times organizations assume that all PMs schedule alike from a work breakdown structure and project scheduling perspective. Actually, the opposite is true. Pretty much every PM has a different way of going about it. So to the degree that you can define what your scheduling best practices are, you're going to be able to drive a much truer perspective of what your project scheduling metrics look like. And then your business value delivered. So are your customers satisfied with the projects that are being delivered? And are you measuring stakeholder satisfaction either through lessons learned type sessions or surveys that you deliver post-delivery? And then what business value is being realized? To what degree are you starting to do business benefits realization? Looking at, did you meet certain goals and objectives that were possibly tied to a business case? Was the project's critical success criteria met? These are all things that can get your business pulled more into metrics, and then they'll start seeing more value into the various processes and practices that your PMO is delivering.